On this channel, I've done a series of videos on the philosophy of orcishness, and I suppose in some ways you can't get much more geeky than that as far as diving into
Yeah.
orcishness and figuring it out. But I actually think that it has some important things to say about what we discuss as a society and fantasy, and I think that you may have some important insight into that. So one of the first things that I did, and this is on the channel and so on playlist, where I went through and I documented the history of the development of orcs from pre-Tolkien all the way through Tolkien and then up until the present day.
And Tolkien changed and evolved how he understood them in his own writings. So yeah.
Yes, as far as I was able to find within his own writing, yes, they changed and evolved. Yes, but you've got the Celtic tradition, which there isn't that I was able to find.
Where does the word come from? I mean, I'm not familiar with the origin of the word pre-Tolkien. What is the
It actually comes from the word, if I can remember from what I had put in all of these videos. I was looking for a connection between orc and the demonic, and it's actually extremely direct linguistically. That you've got orc, you've got orcus, this word that's associated with the underworld, and so in also, I believe it's Beowulf, you have the direct connection between this word orc and its translation later as demon. So you've got.
So we've got orc coming into Norwegian, Scandinavian storytelling in Beowulf 1,000 years ago.
Right. And this was a word that was adopted and brought in by Tolkien, and it became his orcs. And then now it's become everything else that it has become. And, from World of Warcraft and all of this. And one of the things, when I was done writing this, like this history of orcishness and trying to understand orcs, like, for instance, from Demon, like we were just talking about, all the way through, there was this thing that happened in Dungeons and Dragons rather recently that their alignment as evil had been removed. That they're no longer something.
Are they neutral?
Right. Well, the statement is something like this, and this is not an exact quote, but very close. That they removed any type of like racial evilness from the orcs by saying that they are just as capable of choosing their own paths as anybody else. They're good and evil just as humans are.
Which is because that's how Muslims see the jinn, by the way. We see the jinn as the parallel people often say is jinn are like the demons of Christianity. They're not, because there can be demonic jinn. There can be jinn that are evil and malevolent, and there are jinn that are good and they worship God and they do righteousness, right? The range of free will exists within that entity in that tradition, right? Whereas I think most Christians consider you're either an angel or demon, or you've made that choice and you went from angel to demon. So what's interesting that you say that, Heath, is my own, and you probably have much more knowledge because you looked into it, my own understanding of the orc evil conundrum out of Tolkien is I've read some scholarly articles about the Silmarillion, whatever, before sort of the postmodern scholarship on Tolkien, the traditional scholarship, looking at his material rather than projecting onto it political ideologies that have come later. But if some of the early scholarship was talking about the nature of, did Tolkien believe the orcs had free will? Now we understand as the mythology developed that eventually Tolkien identified the orcs as descendants of corrupted elves. They were elves that were stolen by Morgoth, the force of evil, the Satan in his world, of whom Sauron is just a servant, and were taken and were tortured and were abused psychologically, physically, and turned almost into animals, and then forced to breed with each other, like in a breeding experiment. And then the orcs are essentially these devolved form of elves. That's the mythology as I understand it. And I read one scholar suggested that Tolkien believed that the environment in which these orcs were incubated and forcibly bred, right, and multiple generations of the abuse, the cycle of abuse, because they're physically bred in this environment, they almost like animals, they can't escape it, that their elven and their inherent conscience has been suppressed, just like any abused child. If you're living in a system where you're being raised like an animal and the whole system is that, your humanity is stripped away early on, and then you are dehumanized. But that the idea is that Tolkien believed that in theory, an orc could break free of that, but and reestablish their Eru created. Eru is the god of the of the Tolkien world. Eru Iluvatar, the Eru created nature that the elves were given. He could return to that, an orc could return to that, but it's really, really hard because they've essentially been beaten, tortured, and brainwashed and treated like animals from birth. So it's extremely hard to break free, but it's possible. That's my understanding from that scholar's article. I don't know that how that jives with what you've learned.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that does change within Tolkien itself, like his attitude exactly toward the orcs. There is some shifting throughout the decades and the writing, Okay. But so what I was trying to get at, or what I realized as I was writing this, is that, okay, if we start off with this idea of the orc as demon, and then we end up with this idea today as an orc as, let's use the term person. Okay. Yeah. Obviously in today's world, we are hyper aware of making sure that something like an orc in a story doesn't stereotype some particular race or culture or something.
Because we're projecting human ethnic issues onto this fantasy creation. Yeah. Yes.
And we're very aware of that. And so we don't want to do that. Now, but I suppose that my concern with that is that that's what we talk about when we talk about orcishness. It seems like when I was talking to other authors about that. But I was actually more interested in what that says about our society's relationship with the demonic, because it seems like we have progressed the orc. So, it's very important, if you believe in demons or the demonic, that you wouldn't ever want to demonize a human. That humans and demons are different from one another.
You don't want to ontologically, and with regard to the origin story of demons being fallen angels, that they made one choice. Human beings have free will every second of the way, right? I don't know whether in Christian theology a demon can repent. I don't generally hear that concept.
It seems like no, from the people who.
It seems like it's once you made the choice to go down this path, it forever will dominate your destiny, like the Sith.
But that as a human, the choice is still there.
Yeah, so you
wouldn't ever want to
change any moment you want
a human as something demonic, because the human can change.
Correct, because the human has the ability to regain. To regain the light, to regain relationship with God at any moment. Yes.
Whereas ontologically, a demon would not. So you wouldn't want to demonize humans. And we hear that even sort of just today. Don't demonize that person or something like that. But if you think about actually what you're talking about, if you believe in demons, if you have it, or even if you don't, what the demonic means, you don't want to demonize people. But I think that the reverse would also be true. That if you're not supposed to demonize humans, you wouldn't want to humanize demons. That you wouldn't want to humanize the demonic. And so if the orc was a representation of the demonic, and that is something about our attitude toward something that tells us what our attitude toward the demonic should be, which is typically a combative attitude, it seems. Sure. If you're a hero, because it's not easy to be combative towards something demonic. But somebody like Aragorn or other great heroes, one of the reasons they're heroes is because they can be combative toward demons. And so they don't want to humanize the demon. Like, what do you do with the demon? You don't make it a sandwich.
You can try to. Yeah. I mean, there's horror movies where the person thinks he can reach the demon and the demon just destroys him.
That was not the correct response to the demon.
Yeah, they'll always betray you, kind of thing. Yes.
So I was wondering, as I read, going from orc, through people playing orcs in games and in World of Warcraft and stuff like that, as we have we actually humanized the demonic? And does that say something about what we think about evil as a society?
Well, that definitely says what we think about evil as a society. We're again a moment in culture where there is this and there's value to it and there's challenges to it, where the idea is don't generalize, which I think is a fair statement amongst human beings. We've gone through historical periods of fighting the other, and my Crusades novel is all about that, about the Crusaders projecting all their sort of worst instincts onto their Muslim adversaries, and then actually encountering them and realizing that their understanding was just false. I mean, and that's more demoralizing than losing a battle, is that when you're fighting people like when the Crusaders encountered Saladin, who they've been told is this evil infidel tyrant, and he turns out to be this incredibly chivalrous, noble man by their moral standards of chivalry. He's exceeding the chivalry that Richard the Lionheart is showing, who's killing women and children left and right, and Saladin is sending them presents in the middle of battle. Like in the middle of a battle, he would there was a wedding party happening in one of the Crusader camp while Saladin attacked, and in the middle of the battle, he sent presents over to the wedding party and kept fighting, right? But that just came from his inherent nature of his chivalry, which is part of Islamic culture. It's called futua, this kind of chivalry. There's a word for it, and that shattered that kind of dealing with an adversary that was noble by their moral standards and discovering that their projections onto their adversary were false demoralized the Crusaders more than anything else. It wasn't defeat in physical battle. It was just, who are we fighting? Right. My novel goes into that. I mean, are we the bad guys in the story? And that's the most demoralizing moment. So I think all that is healthy in dealing with human beings. So now we're looking at these mythological creations, right, that serve a purpose in story. There is, to my knowledge, there is nothing in Tolkien, including anything in his notes, of any orc that turned good. I don't know of any unpublished short story of the good orc that broke free. I don't think that exists, unless someone has undiscovered notes from Christopher Tolkien or whatever. I don't know. But he did, and he was also writing from a time period, where he did see the world as black and white. He came from, a British Christian background, and he had very strict things at the East, those Orientalist projections, the East is, the Easterlings were evil. But even then, even in his novels, even in The Lord of the Rings, he acknowledges that the Easterlings who were fighting for Sauron had been lied to. So they weren't inherently evil.
And they were different. They were distinguished between them and the orcs. Again, that was correct. If the orcs are the demonic.
Correct. Yeah. Where's the orcs? So here's my thought on the orcs. So part of the problem of in reinterpreting this mythology, which has no basis in the source material, to give these orcs this free will, it's our value judgment about their behavior that makes it uncomfortable. If we thought of orcs as a colony of bees or ants or other insects, they behave in ways that, some fire ants can be very physically dangerous human beings, can kill them, right? And have no problem doing so. And is that evil? Or they're just doing what is inherently programmed into them within their nature? We watch a movie like Them, a classic movie from the 50s, one of my favorite movies from the era of like the nuclear Godzilla, and you have these, nuclear testing creates giant ants. Are the giant ants evil? They're definitely scary, and they're a threat to human beings, and they have to be destroyed. Are they evil? I don't know that they're evil. They're following their natural instincts as evolved creatures to survive and to eat. One would say that the orcs are exactly the same, right? And so projecting onto them our concept of free will, does an ant have free will? Does a bee have free will? I mean, they have a hive mind, and is that immoral? Yeah, they have an instinct, and is that immoral? It can be dangerous. You have to destroy something that's a physical threat to you, but is it evil? I hate insects. I hate cockroaches in particular. I'm scared the hell out of them. Are they evil? They certainly feel like it to me when they come into my home, right? They're not evil. The spiders, they're not evil. They're following their instinct, which just happens to be you're the victim of that instinct. And so you got to defend yourself. And that is, I think, the more accurate way to think of these creatures, especially the orcs who are a bred race. They're not like Morgoth and the fallen Ainur, the sort of angelic beings that Morgoth led a rebellion against Eru the Creator, and Sauron and all these dark figures, followed him and took physical form. But they're essentially they're closer to demons because they made a choice. Whereas the orcs never had a choice. They're just following a programmed instinct that is a threat to the human race. But
that's interesting that demonic, you're associating that in order to be demonic, you need to have made the choice. That's something that does not have a choice.
Made a choice. Orcs never had a choice. And it's not in Tolkien's mythology, to my knowledge, the orcs ever had a choice. They didn't ask to be, their ancestors didn't ask to be kidnapped elves from the woods, taken in and brutalized and horrifically tortured and scarred and physically changed with God knows what chemicals, and then forced to breed with each other like animals. They didn't ask for that, but that's what they got. And their kids didn't ask to be born that way, deformed and abused, but that's what they got. And they're now instinct. They're not evil, but they're a threat. They're an absolute threat that has to be stopped. A virus is not evil. A virus is just doing what it does, but it has to be stopped, as we've been through the last 2 years, or we're in trouble.
Well, that is an interesting, a very interesting take, I think, on the orcs. That if they don't have choice, which actually does come back to things like Satan and the fallen angels and things like that theologically, which I hope we will be able to get to.